All right, we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending today's webinar on the importance of GIS data for emergency response. Before we get started, I will talk about some logistics. Currently, everybody is in listen-only mode. There is a Q&A and a chat box at the bottom of the Zoom panel. If you have any questions during and throughout the presentation, feel free to throw those into the Q&A, and we'll go over those at the end of the presentation. And then if the chat box, we are going to utilize that towards the end of our webinar for some back and forth with some folks that are on today. And as always, this webinar is being recorded, so let's go ahead and get started. I am Rebecca Davis. I'm a senior project manager at Sanborn in the AppGeo division. I am a project manager in the local government realm, focused in spatial IQ for MapGeo product and program. Chris.
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Genovese. I'm a customer support engineer, again, with the AppGeo division. And I pretty much work across all spectrums within the company. And I do kind of specialize a little bit in the NENA and 911 realm.
All right, so before we get into the good stuff, I'm just going to go over the basics of our Spatial IQ for MapGeo program. Spatial IQ is designed to be a managed services program to help you get the most out of the MapGeo subscription, which is one of our products. And throughout the year, we offer a bunch of different support and capabilities for people to expand their GIS, whether there is additional work that you need to be created for new data, if you need things to be updated on an annual basis, particularly for your parcel updates, your address points, different things like that. We also offer a help desk support. So when you have any special data requests or questions that come through related to either the GIS that we help manage or maintain, or if you just have questions, we're there to help you. We also allow for hosted downloadable data to be on your MapGeo site. So if you get frequent requests for your parcels or your buildings or street center lines, anything that you get requests for, you can make that data available to the public to download, or you can keep it so it's just behind a login for internal staff to utilize and share that out. On an annual basis, we publish an overlay theme on the MapGeo site. So on the screenshot on the bottom right-hand side, that was the overlay that we had done last year for renewable energy, calling out where there are different types of energy being produced within a community. We also offer annual strategic planning sessions with towns. We try to get all of the departments together that would and could and should use GIS in town to have those conversations of where there might be gaps in the data and where we can help grow and build the GIS for the town. And of course, these webinars are also included as part of that benefit. So what we're going to be covering today, we're going to go over the importance of GIS data for emergency response, and Chris is going to talk about the NextGen and NENA overview of those programs before we jump into some GIS use cases of the data itself. So just quickly, high level, some of the important things as to why you want to have GIS data for emergency responses. So you're going to have accurate locations, and that's going to equate to faster response times. Having that high quality and accurate data, spatial data, is going to allow your dispatchers to quickly, efficiently route dispatchers to your location, to your response, to your issues. Having good quality GIS data, you're going to get better routing and navigation to from responders to your issue, your emergency, whatever the case may be. By allowing the data to have the most accurate and having the efficiency of your center lines, including all of the attribution that should be part of that to help with dispatching, is going to improve that routing for your dispatchers. Supporting multi-agency coordination, so having your emergency response, your public works, and all of those other types of divisions, departments, groups, all using the same data to coordinate information and disseminate that authoritative data to be utilized in dispatching and helping to respond to emergency is going to be extremely important. Identifying your critical assets. So the GIS will help identify for who and what is most at risk in any emergency situation. And improving the situational awareness. So understanding what's happening, where it's happening, and what's at risk. So just kind of bringing multiple different data layers together, something like hazards, infrastructure, and even utilizing population and census data to understand the highest level of risks in those situations. So location intelligence is going to save time and time saves lives. So that's kind of our theme for today. All right, Chris, let's talk about what's NENA and Next Gen 911.
All right. So I mean, I'm not going to kind of talk about what is NENA as much, but basically it's an organization of, folks, and, be that 911, specific people, or, people just in the GIS, greater groups, things like that, that come together and figure out how could we make data and 911 better. What are the things that are really needed, and how does it function? So, one of the things about next generation, what does that really mean? That's always kind of a question. So, there's the existing 911 systems, and then, which we'll talk about as legacy versus the next gen. So we're talking about GIS data, which is really what drives the next generation 911 servicing. So Rebecca and I were talking a little bit about, way back in the day, one of our slogans was addresses don't move, people do. So we were saying, well, phones don't, if we change that to phones don't move, people do, that's kind of what the existing 911 services are, right? Everybody had, kind of the Ma Bell plugged into the wall phone, and, 911 knew the address of that phone number by that location. That's really not how things happen anymore. Primarily, everybody uses a cell phone, and cell phones are constantly moving. So people generally are not going to pick up an office phone and call 911 when they have their cell phone in their hand already. So that's going to be the device that is now getting utilized. And having a point location for that device and ever increasing accuracy is why the GIS data has to be even better and more accurate now to place those points in the correct locations. Think we next go to the next slide here. So, what is that data? So the new data model actually just came out. I think it was released last month. And basically what it does is it kind of expands some of that, data points relevant to an address point. And the required items, road center lines, the site structure address points, the PSAP boundaries and things like that, those are still the core to what next gen is. And the relevance to that, having that address point as specific as possible, helps tie the location of the call to that address point location. And then with all of that, helps drive, which PSAP does that call go to, which emergency services are allocated to that point from those boundaries, and so on and so forth. And we'll just touch on real quick a little bit, and we'll hit a little bit of this a little bit later, but 3D. Right now, 3D is a little fuzzy in the standard. Those are kind of being modified and updated and created now in a couple different avenues. However, the site structure address point does have the ability to have 3D enabled. So not only can you add in the additional information such as floor and rooms and seats, even things like that, but it could actually be placed correctly within the XYZ of your data. So, the next gen 911 systems can actually take that into account also. And that could come into play in various different scenarios, especially in, high-rise buildings and things like that, or, if we're outdoors, at the top of a cliff or bottom of a cliff, things like that. Um,
One thing
okay,
I'll just add into that too is
yeah.
that NENA's been around for a very long time. I don't know the exact number of years, but their schema and their standards have changed and grown as technology has also changed. So, like Chris said, this new version was just released earlier this year. So they are keeping up with the times and technology. All right, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. So this slide, I think, really does show a good kind of overview of 911 and kind of how these things tie together. So you have your kind of PSAP boundary, where's my call? So as we're talking about GIS data, does my point fall in, this polygon, which polygon? So that immediately brings to the forefront of, making sure our topology and boundaries are correct so we don't have gaps or slivers or overlaps, and that might confuse things. Then, once we have that, you know, the, the 911 authority then is able to locate that point, far more accurately than just being, within XYZ address, so City Hall, that's great. It's a big building. Where is it in City Hall? So that's where, you're kind of able to really start to dial down into that location. And then, which, different emergency services are again allocated to that. And in large structures and campuses, that actually might differ depending on the location. So having an address point, specific to that, and then, your different center lines and things like that that are enhanced to drive to those locations really matter.
All right, so we
So
are gonna take a break for an audio call. If I can get this to come up and launch a poll. All right, everybody should see a pop-up on their screen to answer this quick question. If has your community implemented next-gen 911 standards for GIS data? We have a yes, no, a yes field, a no field, and a somewhat. So if you've started but you're not all the way there yet, or you've implemented a previous version of it, so let's just see what our responses are. We'll give folks a minute to get that in. All right, a couple more trickling in. We're almost at a 50-50 split, give or take. Let's see. I'm going to end the poll and share the results so everybody can see those. But we have 47% said yes, they have implemented this, 29% are no, and then the other half is about 24%. So that's a really good kind of mix all around. So hopefully you take something out of this webinar and you're able to learn something. And if you need help, we'll be there too. So. All right, let me stop the poll and continue on. So now we're going to talk about some use cases with that data that we have. So first we're going to talk about address points and the placement of those points. So here we're showing two different types of examples of where and how you're going to want to place your points. I think for most people, if there's a structure on a parcel, that the address point is going to be placed on that primary residential structure. If there are outbuildings, people will sometimes put a separate address point on a garage, or if there is a multi-family unit and multiple addresses, there will be multiple addresses, address points pointing to those locations. So the example on the left, this did follow one of the early NENA standards. The goal for this was try to place all of the address points at the front door of the residence. Easier said than done in some cases, but that was our goal in trying to do this. I'm sure we've all seen an example of where there is a residence on an intersection of a street. The driveway is on one side, but the front door is on another. So the address for that is on the opposite street of where to access the property in some cases. So that's kind of where the screenshot on the right comes in to show that you can have multiple address points for that location at that property to show where you're going to access the property to get to the residence, where you have their driveway access. And then you also have your address point where your structure is. So diving down to that a little bit more into the attribution side of things, again, trying to follow some of the standards. This is an old standard. I'm not sure how much has changed on this one, but in this case, we were collecting the parcel ID or the property ID, and then all of our important address information. So you have your house number, you have your street name, that is fully spelled out. I know in a lot of cases, some people and some communities have S for south or N for north, but in this case, we like to have all of those completely spelled out. You have your zip code. In some towns, there are multiple main streets, one on the north side, one on the south side. So having that zip code will also help differentiate where and what main street you are on. Identifying what building you are in if there are multiple buildings, particularly for a condo or an apartment complex. So if you're in building C on floor 2, and then your unit number would be 2A, and your location would be a structure in that case. We've seen other examples, and some other non-residential examples would be something like a park. At a particular park, there may be a swimming pool, there might be a splash pad, there might be a pavilion, a playground, a whole bunch of different things. So that's where your landmark, and location will really come into play when you want to fill those attributes out to help identify where in that park you are, when you call for an emergency, that dispatch will quickly and easily and efficiently be able to get to your location. So kind of transitioning off of the address points and kind of dipping into that 3D realm of things with the floors and everything, getting into interior and indoor mapping. So a great way of starting this is to start with a 2D floor plan, and providing that to your PSAPs and your dispatching office. So if you're in classroom 1, 2, 3, and there's an emergency, the first responders will be able to get to you, understand where all of the access points are, and then also obviously what floor you're on. So here too, we also can see that this location has the room numbers taped to the windows. So you're able to see what room you are in from the outside of the building to also aid in that location assistance when responding. And then
Yeah,
taking
just
that, oh, go ahead, Chris.
yeah, I was just gonna add, one thing to this, actually two things I should say. One, the having something like this, really helps with placement of, site structure address points. So if you're getting to that room level, your point could be in each one of those locations, kind of like where those numbers are. And that really helps a lot in terms of, kind of driving the location for the point. And then the second thing is part of the data model, although not a required layer, site structure address polygons are part of that, the new standard. So you could actually, kind of bring this in within the standard also.
Yeah, and then expanding further onto that, you can have the modeling of the 3D aspect as well. And this is a Revit model. It can also be brought into CAD. Chris, if you want to talk a little bit kind of how that works in the dispatching, for the 3D models.
Yeah, I mean, currently the interior mapping model, at least from the NENA perspective, is something that's getting worked on right now. So, that design and how that's, going to get implemented specifically within the NENA model is, something for the future. However, many CAD systems have the ability to integrate various different levels of 3D and, kind of the building and CAD models and Revit models and things like that. So, every piece of data that can be provided, whether in a planning phase or in a responding phase, to help the responders is always going to be, of benefit.
Yeah, calling out that planning phase too. I know for like evacuation purposes, if there's a fire and there's something else going on and they need to get people out of a building. They kind of have the fastest and quickest routes to allow people to get out efficiently. And one of my favorite examples is the utilities down at the bottom. I think a lot of us kind of default, oh, if it's an emergency, it must be people, but can also be utilities and assets as well. So if there's something that's happening with a gas line, that they can go directly in here and see, okay, the gas line is next to the green box or something like that, to quickly and effectively go turn off whatever that leak may be. So that's really helpful for folks on the first responder side, and even just on the owner side of whoever maintains this building. Like we said, that interdepartment coordination with the different agencies to have public works and the school systems be able to have this information as well to help aid in those responses. All right, so it's kind of taking a different step to things and looking at emergency response times and distances. So this is an analysis that we had run for the town of West Hartford to show where all of their fire stations are and the distance from each of those stations to see if there were any gaps. So here's an example on the left. That is where headquarters is. So you can see that every part of the town is within a 5-mile radius of the headquarters fire station. Then on the right-hand side, we have where Station 5 is, and we can see that that's on the kind of the southern part of the town. So the northern section of town would be a greater than 5-mile radius from that station. Again, this is not taking in travel time, not taking into consideration any traffic or anything like that. That would be a separate analysis that we would run for them. But this just shows that if there's an emergency up on that north section, you would not want, ideally, you would not want to dispatch somebody from Station 5 in that case. Again, there are clearly 5 different stations in this town, so they do have one in the north, but just to show that example. And being able to help run these analyses for the towns like that. Critical infrastructure. So again, this hits one of those key points that I had covered up in the beginning of understanding where all of your critical infrastructure is within your town. So here within a very small 2-mile span of this kind of downtown area for Essex, they have a town hall where their state trooper office is. They have a library. They have several gas stations. They have a couple of emergency response centers, which I believe in this case are fire stations. And they have a school as well as a low-income housing. So if there was an emergency in this area, they'd be able to know where they need to get to and what those infrastructure facilities are that are critical for them during those responses. And again, linking any other data, if there's a 3D model of one of the schools or the town hall that they can utilize to help aid in that response. That's kind of where all of the ideas and these different types of layers that you can kind of add on top of each other come into play. This is another interesting one that we've done for emergency assets. So this is looking at primarily on commercial and industrial buildings where there are important emergency assets, either to shut off a gas main, to see where all of the fuel propane storage tanks are, if there's a meter that needs to be turned off. You have all of your FDCs, which are your fire department connections. So if something needs to be part of the fire department's response, they have that there. They also have the Knox boxes identified. So that's where you can store a key, an access key card or something to get into the building without having to break a door or break a window to gain access to respond to that emergency. So this is something that's interesting that the town uses internally for their responses. And continuing off of that, looking at actual utilities. So primarily we're looking here at the water system and where all of their fire hydrants are. So they know where there are fire hydrants available for a fire situation. Being able to know where those are and the distance that you're going to from your emergency address is going to be really important if there's a location that either might need a tanker truck, if there is no water source available from a hydrant and or an actual water body. So understanding where your utilities are, again, too, looking at it from a different side that I don't have an example for would be gas, understanding where your gas shutoff valves are, if there's a gas leak or a break of some kind, all of those are important to have for them. Another unique one is a special needs address list. So in this example, the town has collected a list of addresses and residents that are of special needs in some way or another. So all of the residents' names are part of that list. Again, I've blurred that out in this example here. If they are in an emergency plan zone, that's what the EPZ is. So if they are in potentially a where there's industrial activity or nuclear activity or some other type of like mass destruction that could happen from a particular event, even if it's a hurricane or flooding or something like that too, they know where all of their at risks residences are. You're also pulling out if they have any special needs. So in this case, there is a potential wheelchair user. So having a ramp to get in and out of the house or having the ability to get that wheelchair in and out. If the resident is on oxygen, or if there's any other comments and notes to be included. So in this particular example, this person is lives in Florida part time for the winter. So we are up in New England for this example, and then a contact person as well for that resident that they have. So I think this is an interesting one. I haven't seen a lot of examples of these before, but it's one that I wanted to call out. And then one of our last examples that we have are hiking trail maps. These are two different examples, kind of calling out key marks along the trail. So the bigger screenshot in the middle, this is of Ellington in Connecticut. They have emergency trail markers on along their trail, whether it's on a tree or on a separate post, along the trail, calling out just specific markers. So if you're hiking and you get injured, you sprain an ankle or you break an ankle, you can say, "Oh, I'm between my emergency marker H8 and H9 at the bridge." Something along those lines to kind of help the first responders get to you. Um, Also, within all of their trail maps, they have a little index that kind of says, as you're walking the trail, you're going to notice yellow markers with an alphanumeric design. This is to help in emergency situations when you call 911. When you get to the dispatcher, you're going to give them the Ellington town code and stay where you are so personnel can find you. So this is something that's been implemented in the last 2.5, 3 years for the town. And they have officially got all of their trails identified with these emergency markers. So it's been really helpful for them. And another example is just landmarkers themselves. So here we have trail bridges that are kind of being called out, as well as a teepee, which is like another point of interest along the trail to also help identify where you are. So if you know that you've recently passed Bridge 7, but you know you haven't gotten to 8, you're somewhere in that big stretch in the middle. Again, not exact, but that's also where the next gen comes into play to also help better place where you are when you make that call to 911. All right, so we have another question for you guys, and I saw that someone put in the Q&A that the chat is disabled, and I don't know how to enable that. So, if you guys could put anything in the Q&A box to answer this question, if there are any other GIS use case examples for emergency response that we did not cover that you would like to share, just to give folks some ideas that you've gone over that we haven't shared.
Yeah, and there is one question in there. And I guess it's, can you speak specifically how Sanborn assists clients with GIS needs and services? And boy, that's a big question. So I guess we could start at the high level. So we'll start with kind of that, needs assessment kind of level where we could talk to, the customer and go over, what do they have, what does it look like, how could they get to whatever their vision for their GIS is. If they don't have that, we could kind of say, okay, this is what, generally you would be looking to accomplish. So let's say it was in terms of address points. How can you, work with what you have to meet the data model, and then how does that roll up, say, into a higher, data set. So, many states roll up local data sets into a full data set. So does it roll into the 911 authority directly, or does it go into somebody else that rolls it into the 911 authority? Outside of that, there's many other, services that we offer, whether that's data collection, aerial, LiDAR, field collection of GPS points. I think Rebecca was talking about, fire hydrants and, locations like that to, give, the best accuracy to the data, that would be needed, as well as indoor mapping and parcel mapping updates. And oh
We
boy,
do it all.
I could keep going on, but did I miss something, Rebecca, that I should have
No,
said?
I think that was a pretty comprehensive list. Yeah, so if you need any help in any side of the GIS to get things into the NENA standard, if you are starting from complete zero and you have no address points, there are multiple ways for us to obtain that data, whether it's taking an existing data set and utilizing that to create XY locations based on address and geocoding, or if you need other data to be created for you, such as hydrants and other things like that. We're certainly there to help in any aspect that we need to, if it's from the computer using what we have for resources, or if it's out in the field to collect accurate locations of hydrants, for example.
And a comment was just put into the Q&A, using building polygons to buffer against tree polygons to help with Fire Smart program.
Awesome.
I think that's awesome. That is a really great use of GIS. That's, again, another aspect of something that we can do is, create, from existing aerial and LiDAR, where are the trees? What's the land use? What's the land cover in a particular area, and create data sets pertinent for that use.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing. So just kind of to wrap it up, that location intelligence saves time, and that time does save lives, going back to our kind of first motto there. And we're here to help. I'm not going to go over everything that Chris just shared on how we can help, but we are here. Here is our contact information. We want to thank all of you, and we will stay on. If there are any other questions, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A box, and we'll stay on for a minute. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending, and the recording will be posted to our library webinar and share it out with all of those who registered. So thank you so much.